Thank you everybody for joining today's session on maximizing your strength as an introvert. We will go ahead and get started momentarily, but before diving into the content, I wanted to say a quick thank you to Vishal for moderating this conversation and to Gary for organizing the logistics and slides for today's calls. It has been great to collaborate with you both. To provide a quick overview of my background for those who I have not met, my name is Triston Francis and I attended Wharton where I majored in finance, legal studies, and business ethics. While in college, I spent summer internships within sales at Google, then private wealth management at Goldman Sachs, then investment banking at Morgan Stanley, where I joined full time after graduation. While at Morgan Stanley, I worked across a variety of divisions. I started by covering consumer retail companies within investment banking. Then I transitioned to sales and trading, where I covered our largest asset management accounts. After doing this for a few years, I joined an internal strategy role to help launch a team focused on increasing business with Asian, Black, and Hispanic clients. And after all of these experiences, I then moved into talent management and focused on internal mobility and specifically how to move our top performing analysts from one division to another. After Morgan Stanley, I went to Harvard Business School for my MBA. I had three primary goals during business school. First, I wanted to develop leadership skills. Second, I wanted to study organizational behavior. And third, I wanted to gain personal clarity on the type of work that I wanted to pursue with my life. There were two main experiences at Harvard that enabled me to develop as a leader. First, I served as the student body co-president of my class. In this role, my objective was to foster a cohesive, collaborative community on campus. I had the opportunity to lead an exceptional, diverse team of more than 70 classmates and manage a budget of more than 1.3 million. The second experience was serving as the education representative for my section. As context, each MBA class at Harvard is approximately 930 students, which is broken down into 10 groups of 93, which we refer to as a section. Every section elects one representative who serves as the liaison to their professors. These two roles allowed me to give back to my community while fueling my growth as a leader. In terms of classes, I focused largely on organizational behavior. My highlight was spending 1.5 years working with Professor Leslie Perlow, who serves as the head of research at Harvard Business School. Alongside a small group of MBA students, we co-designed a course called Crafting Your Life, which launched in the fall of 2019 and has been taught to roughly 100 MBA students at Harvard thus far. This course aims to help students clarify their purpose and live with greater intentionality. While serving as a research associate, I completed approximately 120 alumni interviews. Each interview began with the same question: tell me about how your life unfolded after HBS, highlighting the major personal and professional transitions which you went through. What were the trade offs that you had to make, and how did you come to those decisions? In addition to informing the modules that would be taught during the Crafting Your Life course, these conversations provided me with tremendous personal and professional clarity around the impact that I aspire to have. The impact I want to have with my life can best be summarized through two core questions that I hope to spend as much time as possible thinking through during my career. The first core question is, how can companies create a culture where their employees are engaged and excited about their work on a daily basis? The second core question is, how can one best help another person reach their full potential? To address my core questions at an organizational level, the relevant topics where deep expertise will best enable me to have an impact are organizational design, human capital management, as well as diversity, equity, and inclusion. I joined consulting as a way to continue developing my expertise in these areas, and I felt that the Boston Consulting Group, and particularly our people and organization practice area, would be an ideal way for me to further explore and build experience within these topics. At an individual level, the relevant skills that will best enable me to help people reach their full potential include coaching, public speaking, and writing. Every few weeks, I host an open invite professional development event on Zoom. In addition to giving back and helping professionals navigate their career, I also cherish these sessions as a way of honing my coaching, public speaking, and writing skills. This ultimately equips me to most effectively help others reach their full potential and prepares me to accomplish this mission at scale. If interested in learning more about the Open Invite professional development events and to see a list of the upcoming sessions, please visit my personal website or scan the QR code on the left. If the upcoming event topics do not include your greatest areas of interest, please let me know what topics you would like to see covered, as I welcome suggestions. Feel free to reach me via a message on LinkedIn or by scanning the QR code on the right. Thank you again for tuning in for this discussion. Without further ado, I am excited to dive into today's conversation on maximizing your strength as an introvert.
All right, I guess we can get started. Thank you all for joining today. And as you guys can see, the topic for today's discussion is maximizing your strengths as an introvert. We all have worked in professional environment and professional setting, and it becomes important for an introvert to understand the unique traits that one has, and also for the extroverted colleagues to understand their introverted colleagues better. So before we get started with the discussion, I'll take you through the agenda for today. We'll start out with an introduction by Tristan. Some of you might have already attended a few of his sessions, and some of you might be attending for the first time. After which, we'll have a discussion about the different questions that we have received from you guys. We have collated those questions, and post that, we'll open up for Q&A. You can uh, type in your questions, or you can probably turn on your camera and speak up. Uh, some of the house rules for the discussion: please remain muted unless you are speaking, and please feel free to ask questions. You can type in your questions even during the discussion, and we can probably take those up during the Q&A session. Yep. Now let's begin with an introduction from Tristan. Tristan, over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Vishal. Just to quickly give an introduction. So I'm originally from New York. I had gone to Wharton undergrad where I'd studied finance, legal studies, and business ethics. A big turning point in my life was in 10th grade, I found out that I was dyslexic. And at that point, I was matched up with a learning coach. And I share this in large part because I think it kind of goes hand in hand in terms of my journey of overcoming different obstacles that have been important in terms of really maximizing my ability to be impactful in a workplace setting. Yeah, after that, yeah, we can go to the next slide. Um, so on the topic of introversion, one of the things that I found really impactful in terms of kind of getting to a place where I was comfortable was like everything else, I feel like it takes a lot of practice. So when I arrived in college as a freshman, found it very difficult to approach people, introduce myself, do all of the things that freshmen normally are doing when they're settling in. And I really wanted to overcome this feeling that was kind of a combination of being introverted but not knowing how to navigate that in a setting where whether it's college or in the workplace, I feel like oftentimes it feels like those who are a little bit more boisterous by nature have an edge. And so a big way that I was able to kind of transform myself effectively in these ways was running through student government. So as an example, my freshman year of college, I decided to go door to door and really petition for student government. And for me, the idea of going door to door was terrifying because the thing that made me the most nervous was walking up to peers and introducing myself for the first time and so forth. But the way I thought about it is that I would just go into the halls, and if I, knocked on the door, the worst thing that could happen was I would get some experience. So, meaning I would try something and it would feel uncomfortable, but then I would have an experience to be able to sit with and really think about why it was uncomfortable. And it just is something that was really difficult. But as I started doing it more and more, began to become a lot more comfortable with it. And then after getting elected to student government, I realized that if I could go from being really nervous about walking up and introducing myself to somebody to representing my class, it really gave me a lot of confidence in terms of what was possible when you apply intentionality to developing in an area that you really want to develop. So that, I guess, began my beginning of really trying to pursue leadership. Ultimately, becoming president of one of the business organizations on campus, an honor society, a college house RA. In many ways, I found that these leadership activities actually make it easier for me to engage with people because the part that gives me the most discomfort when it comes to meeting new people is actually just walking up to the person and introducing myself for that first time. So it's the initial part. Once the conversation is going, I tend to find a little bit more comfort in that. And so what I like about leadership positions is when you are in a leadership position, I found that people will come to you. So in my mind, it has in some ways removed the most difficult part in terms of my own experience, in terms of really navigating business and school as an introvert. And then I would say, yeah, if we move on, so um, in terms of professionally and experiences, while I was in college, had a chance to intern at Google, Goldman, and Morgan Stanley. Um, each of these, especially I would say in Goldman, which was private wealth management, and then Morgan Stanley, which was investment banking, I felt like both of these were environments that again kind of felt like they were naturally catered towards people who were more boisterous and extroverted. So I think what this led me to is really taking a step back in these environments and starting to think about were there ways that I could contribute, using, as today's topic will be about, what are some of the unique strengths that I have that I'll be able to contribute in these settings. And so, if you're in an environment where it feels like everybody is speaking nonstop, then, there's potentially a lot of value that can be added by being somebody who is listening and synthesizing. And so I think that navigating the different internships, this was something I started to see kind of around me. And then after Morgan Stanley, I went back to business school. And then while I was in business school, again, having seen the impact that leadership had during my time in college, I decided that I was going to do that again during business school, ideally. Decided to run for student body co-president. And in this case, I learned another powerful lesson in that I paired up with, so at HBS, you always have two people that are co-presidents of the class. And so my co-president was very extroverted. And so for people who are introverted, another thing that I found that can be really helpful is, being thoughtful about who you're pairing yourself up with. And little things like, my co-president is very animated when she speaks. And so when we would do speeches together, we would intentionally have her open up the speech in a way that was very kind of warm and outgoing. And then we kind of would usually go back and forth. But just remember, like everything, it's oftentimes a team situation. And so if you are introverted, you feel like that is makes certain tasks that you have to do challenging. What I'd encourage you to do is think about who else on your team might be, maybe more naturally comfortable with the task. And I think if you can align yourself to the tasks where you're more likely to succeed, and then, build in and bring in people around you to complement you, I think that that's a really impactful strategy. Whether it's counterbalancing on that introverted extroversion scale or something else. So with that, just wanted to share some opening remarks, and Vishal, I'll turn it over to you to kind of lead us in the conversation. But I'm really hoping that, it's a small group that we have on the line. So I'm really hoping that the discussion today will be as candid as possible. So please do feel free to unmute yourself, dive into the conversation, and so forth.
Thank you so much, Tristan, for the brief introduction. So let's start with the most important topic for today, and that would be again knowing what the unique qualities one has as an introvert. So, Tristan, what, according to you, would be some of the unique qualities that an introvert possesses, and how can these traits be tapped into in their professional career?
Yeah, so I think that introverts, myself, if I were to kind of speak from personal experience in terms of some of the things that I feel like are unique strengths, I think the ability to really listen and read rooms. So I think when it comes to being observant, introverts, tend to, if one isn't speaking, they're oftentimes listening and watching. So if there's a more boisterous colleague who is speaking, more often, they might not be able to capture as much of what's going on in the room. And that can be really, if I'm thinking about my time in Morgan Stanley in a sales context, if you're in a room full of people and you have the key, account manager that's kind of chatting it up with a client, but it's a group of people, there might be a whole lot of dynamics that are taking place that it will be harder for the person who's speaking to actually make note of. And so I oftentimes find myself um, in situations where I'm speaking with people that I'm providing my perspective in terms of the read on the room. And I generally find that people find that to be helpful. So I'd say that's one area that introverts can really be impactful. And then in general, I think that introverts tend to leave room for other people to kind of lead and to act. So I think if, from a manager perspective, I think that there could potentially be, more space created for a direct report to ultimately, try to come up with an idea, see how that idea runs, as opposed to I found that in some settings, if you have two people that are very extroverted, very much kind of trying to put their idea out there, you don't actually have you don't actually have steady progress being made towards an objective. And so I find that a nice balance between either two people or in a team setting in general can help, because can really help make sure that you have the healthy flow of ideas, which I think that extroverts can certainly bring through conversations, while also having that counterbalance in terms of just in terms of having, really a measured approach to kind of tackling a topic.
And then, like you mentioned, listening skills is something that can come in handy for an introvert. But that also means that sometimes there can be certain misconceptions about them. For example, they might be seen as a bit reserved. So, are there any particular misconceptions that you might have faced in your professional career, and what can probably the extroverted colleagues do to be more considerate towards the introverted peers?
Yeah, I think that one misconception that I definitely feel like I encounter a lot is that people will sometimes assume that introverts are either not enjoying themselves. If it's, as an example, if it's a social gathering and a team is out at a restaurant or a bar or something like that, and there's somebody who's introverted, and rather than kind of mingling and talking to everybody, they find themselves just kind of seated and talking, but having a really in-depth conversation with one person. Some people might have the misconception that that person wasn't enjoying the social event or wasn't happy to be there or something like that. When I tend to find that, overall, an introvert is going to be more inclined to enjoy a really high quality, in-depth one-on-one conversation with one person, as opposed to, popcorning around and having shorter conversations with a lot of different people. So I'd say that that's one misconception. I think another misconception is kind of confusing introversion and shyness. So, sometimes when I'm, generally pretty comfortable when it comes to talking about myself, if I'm posed with a question, and sometimes I will be met with almost a surprise reaction with, I'm surprised you're so open and willing to kind of share, given that you view yourself as an introvert, when really in my mind those two things are very much separated. So when I'm talking about introversion, I'm really boiling it down to thinking about it in terms of energy, and specifically what gives me energy and what drains me from an energy perspective. And the reason I see myself as an introvert is the things that give me energy are smaller settings, time by myself, versus somebody who's extroverted. They might get energy from, going to a place where there's a lot of people around, where there's a lot of music. That's the kind of thing that actually, on the reverse side, will tend to drain me of my energy. So I think that everything that moves away from that view of introversion on the spectrum of how does it impact your energy, I think can often lead to some of the misconceptions that I've encountered.
All right. Thank you so much, Tristan, for sharing that. And moving on to networking. Networking is something that an introvert can find challenging, and is something that I've personally faced. So, you have managed to foster a great network. As an introvert, what are some of the challenges that you might have faced when you were building your network, and how did you overcome them?
Yeah, so for me, one of the biggest challenges goes back to that experience that I felt like I had in my freshman year of college. The biggest challenge has always been approaching people kind of in person. So if I think about going to a conference, that's a really challenging context for me to actually meet people. So for me, what I did that I found was really helpful is I was able to, I guess, lean on the elements of relationship building that were not difficult for me. So I tend to be a very proactive person. I tend to, in terms of sending emails and something like that. So for me, if I'm reaching out to somebody and I'm setting up a 20, 30-minute coffee chat or phone call, that's easy to do. That doesn't kind of drain me, that doesn't exhaust me in the same way that if I were going to a happy hour, but I had to kind of go up and introduce myself, um, that would leave me a little bit more drained. So I'd say that in terms of relationship building, I was just really thoughtful, about where I did spend my time and where I didn't spend my time. So if I think about that and translate that into a business school context, I went to very few happy hours while I was in business school. In my mind, going into a bar where there's 50 plus classmates, and I'm naturally soft spoken, so I don't want to have to try and raise my voice to compete with the music. I felt like this isn't going to be a scenario where I am really going to get to know somebody. But what I did make a habit of doing is every time somebody would invite me to a happy hour or would ask me, "Hey, are you coming to the happy hour tonight?" I would just mention, "No, I can't. Like, I'm not going to make it, but, would you be up for grabbing, lunch tomorrow, or, dinner later this week, or coffee, whatever it might be." I translated that, and in my mind, I think that my ability, if that person is asking you, "Hey, are you going to this larger scale event?" Chances are they're posing that question because they're hoping that you'll be there, because they're hoping that there will be an opportunity to get to know you better. In my mind, I know that everybody that posed that question to me, for sure, I was able to get to know them much better in the context of, grabbing a meal with them or grabbing one-on-one coffee with them, as opposed to what would have happened had I gone to the happy hour. So I think I'm just very intentional about what settings I do go to and what settings I don't go to. And I try not to let the fear of like missing out force me into settings where I just know it's not going to be the comfortable way in which I want to build relationships. So for everybody, I really encourage you to think about what are the scenarios where you are comfortable meeting new people, and create environments where you can meet people in your like, while still meeting people, but in a setting that is comfortable enough for you, that it really doesn't drain you.
That's some great advice, Tristan. And you already spoke about how you approach your in-person conversations, but there has been a recent increase in your virtual conversations, right? So how has that made a difference in how you would approach a conversation with someone?
Yeah. So actually, in many ways, the virtual world has made it easier to reach out to people and to find time. I think the virtual world in many ways actually counterbalances, and in some ways is really helping introverts. As an example, if you're thinking about a team meeting, where it used to be difficult to it can sometimes be difficult if you have a bunch of people in a team room for an introvert to speak up quickly enough to get their point in. I find that it's a lot easier to do on Zoom, especially if your team has norms like, everybody staying on mute. And then when you have something to say, you can unmute yourself, because it's really easy. It becomes easy for an introvert to signal that they have something to share just by unmuting themselves, or by clicking the Zoom button to raise their virtual hand, or even by, if everybody's kind of talking over each other, which sometimes happens when you have a heavy proportion of extroverts in the room, and that can make it really difficult for an introvert to engage. Even something as easy as just kind of like making the motion as though you're going to say something, is usually enough of a cue to have people kind of, let there be a pause, so that you and other people have the space to kind of join in. So I think in many ways the virtual setting has actually just made it easier. At least that's what my experience has been. In terms of how I approach conversations, virtually versus in person. Um, in person, I would say that I usually, before going into a conversation, generally speaking, I try to think to myself, okay, what am I hoping to convey during this conversation? And are there any questions that I want to ask? And I'll usually almost like come up with like mini talking points in my head.
I do that in person or I do that virtually. I guess the only difference is that when you do it virtually, I'll usually have like an agenda, or I'll usually type something up and have it on screen. That even if you don't look at it, it still gives me confidence knowing that I've kind of prepared for the conversation. And similarly, even in in-person meetings, I would have the equivalent of like an index card, and I might jot down a few notes on an index card and I might put it in my pocket. And just knowing that it is there and that I have thought about what do I actually want to speak about in this conversation, I find gives me a lot of comfort going into conversations. And in general, if you find that you are uncomfortable when it comes to relationship building, networking, meeting new people, anything that you can do to put yourself at ease is going to allow you to make that conversation better and more impactful.
All right. So moving on, public speaking again is another area where introverts struggle sometimes. And then you have been public speaking coach. And how can one overcome that fear? And what steps did you yourself take if you ever had to?
Yeah, on the public speaking front, I definitely had to take a lot of steps. This was not something that was easy for me, but in college, I really made an effort to do it. The way that I made an effort to do it was I actually signed up for a course on public speaking and then trained to become a public speaking coach because I think that observing other people give a presentation and then offering feedback to that individual, like everything, coaching somebody else at doing something is really going to heighten your senses in terms of what is effective public speaking and how you can improve. So I found that to be really helpful. The other thing I would say is in general, I tend to take every single opportunity that I can to do public speaking. So I'm sure everybody has been in that group setting where the presenter is asking for you have breakouts of some sort, and the presenter is asking for one person from the breakout group to share the ideas. Almost always, I would say 90% of the groups that I'm in, nobody raises their hand to be that person. I'm almost every single time I am the person to raise my hand and to actually just try. And sometimes will go well, and sometimes it won't go well. Both of those outcomes are good. If it goes well, great. You've gotten some good exposure. If it doesn't go well, you've gotten some good practice. And so I think that in general, I would encourage people to raise their hand, be that person to speak on behalf of your group as much as possible. And then lastly, I would say everybody can kind of create if you don't have a forum to practice public speaking, you can either join organizations like Toastmasters International, which they have chapters in cities all throughout the world. And then, you can practice actually by getting a lot of feedback as you're delivering these different types of speeches and so forth. Or you can also just create an audience for yourself. And so I think these open invite Zoom events, as an example, that I've been doing is been a great forum for me to be able to actually practice and get feedback and so forth. And I feel like it's also, it's an idea that anybody can basically replicate. So everybody on this call who's a college student, there's a whole world of high school students that are really curious about what college would be like. I'm sure you can find a way to get a group of high school students together and practice giving a presentation. For those who have graduated and are a few years into work, there's a whole world of college students out there that I'm sure you could, get a small group of people together and practice. So I'd say it really comes from just actually practicing, getting feedback. Highly encourage everybody to, when you're doing these sessions, have them recorded, and so that you can rewatch yourself, and that can be a good way of getting yourself feedback also. So I'm very much a believer of, when it comes to public speaking, it's the number of times that you're able to really practice, and the amount of high quality feedback that you are able to get, I think, is what will get you a lot more comfortable in the area of public speaking.
Yep, definitely. Starting out in smaller groups can definitely help. But you mentioned taking the initiative in breakout rooms can be one of the ways that you can take initiative, right? So, but sometimes people tend to hold themselves back, and then that's out of fear of looking stupid or people questioning their logic. So, what advice would you have for people to share their ideas openly and confidently?
Yeah, so I think it's one of those things where everybody believes when they're walking around in the world that everybody is paying attention to them and that they are focused on them and on the lookout for what they are doing and so forth. When the reality is everybody, for the most part, is focused on their own lives. And people, generally speaking, are not out to get you. If you feel like the people around you are out to get you, then I think that I would rethink the circles that you're spending time in. And or if you're at a company and you feel like that's the culture of the company, then I would question whether or not that's really going to be an environment that's going to allow you to grow and flourish. But generally speaking, I think that people tend to have that belief in their head that people are looking and listening to their words and trying to catch the slip up in the statement that they made, when the reality is, generally speaking, people have your best interests and they want you to succeed. You succeeding oftentimes means the team succeeds and does better. So in general, I'd say if you're doubting or questioning your logic or ideas, what I would say is, if you're really uncertain about it and you don't feel comfortable in a setting, then maybe turn your idea into a question. Build on. There's always ways to engage without kind of putting your own thought first and foremost. You can build on somebody else's idea. But in general, I would say, it is most likely something that is in your head if you're questioning, okay, should I actually be speaking up? And 9 times out of 10, I feel like if you're, and especially if you're somebody who naturally has introverted tendencies, if you're asking yourself, should I really be speaking up right now? The answer is probably definitely yes. If you're asking yourself that question, um, you should almost aim to speak so much that you're going to be hogging. Like if you're somebody that doesn't really speak in general, you should make it your goal to like almost be that person who is consuming a lot of the airtime, because the reality is if you make it your goal to do that, you're probably not actually going to come anywhere close to doing that. So let's say there's a group of 5 people and the goal is everybody gets 20% airtime. In your head, you should almost have your goal as like 25% airtime, which would be in theory too much. Realizing that in general, we tend to over like estimate how much we are actually speaking, especially for people who are naturally reserved. So if you're aiming for 25%, you'll probably come in at 15 to 20%. Of course, I'm making these numbers up, but I'm just saying if you're generally somebody that does not share a high enough volume of times, then force yourself to, in your mind, overshare, and you'll probably end up somewhere around the right mark.
All right. Yep. So moving on, so far we've discussed what are some of the qualities and traits of an introvert and some of the issues that they might face. And then now coming on to the point of empowering introverts, it's important for a leader to probably have a balance of personalities in their organization. And then what can a leader do to achieve this balance and also make sure that the contributions of your reserved or the introverted employees are not overlooked?
Yeah. So I'd say questions. Questions can be a really powerful way of doing this. So if there's somebody on your team that you feel like isn't contributing an idea when they really probably have a helpful perspective to make, pose them a question saying, hey, Triston, what do you think about this? Or, Triston, last week you and I were talking about this thing that actually, now that we're talking about it, seems pretty related in this context. What are your thoughts on this? Inviting people into a conversation and posing, direct questions to the individual can really be helpful. And if it's a small team meeting and you don't want to make it, feel like you're putting a person on the spot, then pose quick questions to both sides. Like pose questions. So be somebody who actually asks targeted questions during this meeting, and really create the space for that. If somebody that is, tends to not speak up as much in meetings, when they do speak up, give them that positive reinforcement, follow up with them afterwards, send them a message saying, hey, I'm so glad that you mentioned X, Y, and Z in the meeting. That was actually a really good point. And, thank you for, thank you for mentioning that. The more positive reinforcement you give somebody, the more that they are going to ultimately feel comfortable sharing their ideas on a regular basis with the team. So I think it can, with a manager that applies a lot of intentionality and is self-aware, I think they have the ability to really draw people who who may feel introverted or uncomfortable, really draw them into the conversation. And that's another thing that, back to the subject of maximizing your strength as an introvert, I think that that's one area where introverts can make exceptional managers. So as an introvert, I think I am far more likely to observe when there's somebody who is being softer, who is not mentioning as or speaking up as much, because I know that that has often been me in group settings. And so you're kind of keenly aware of it. And by being keenly aware of it, you can make modifications, simple things like if, the seat that you choose to take in a meeting room. And if there's somebody that on your team that's been having a hard time jumping into the conversation, sitting next to that person, and finding a way in the middle of the meeting to mention over to that, like lean over and say, hey, like, I remember that you have a lot of perspectives on this. Actually, I think it might be really relevant, whatever it is, teeing the person up. So I think that being on the lookout for it, and then when you observe somebody who isn't speaking up or may not feel comfortable speaking up, really creating an environment that makes it easy for them to do that.
All right. Yeah, positive reinforcements can definitely help in fostering that inclusive environment. I think with that, we have come to the end of questions that we had received, and we can now open up the forum for Q&As. If you have any questions, feel free to type it in the chat, or you can turn on your video and speak up. And I see that, okay. Tristan, Billy had a question. Would the recording of this session be shared later? He has reached out to me directly.
Yes, I'm happy to share the recording.
It's an open forum. Feel free to type in your questions or even turn on your video. And
Hey Vishal, I'm Mithun here.
hey,
Hi, am I audible? I have a
yeah,
question for
Mithun,
Tristan. Hi Tristan,
please.
as an individual in a client-facing role, especially when stakes are high, how do you ensure that your introversion doesn't interfere with your job?
Yeah, so I think that thinking about the client implications, it's a really good point in terms of thinking about the ways in which it could impact a career trajectory, an individual, and so forth. I'd say that in terms of building that relationship with the client, um, I'd say that there's a lot of different ways that you can build trust. One of it is through conversations, finding commonalities, and another point. Another way is just by delivering high quality work. So what I generally find is that it's a matter of actually understanding the client and the person as an individual, and then thinking about what matters to him or her, and how can you actually how can you deliver something that's going to make their life better. And you can make people's lives better either by delivering high quality work, or just by getting to know them on a personal level so that it's pleasant. They have something to look forward to. If you're going to have daily morning meetings, do they look forward to seeing you on the other end of that Zoom camera or in that meeting room, or do they dread it? And whether it's the first or the second makes a really big difference in terms of their quality of life. So I guess I would say my general approach when I'm getting to know clients is I try to allow them to get to know as much of me as possible. I try to make sure, especially in a consulting context, I feel like we come in and sometimes, like we have the mandate, quote unquote, from the senior executive team. And so I think everything that I can do to basically come in with as much humility as possible, and kind of not lean on, oh, we were told by the CEO to do X, Y, and Z, but rather posing questions, listening to them, connecting the content of where we're ultimately trying to go to what it is that they're saying, using their words sending messages to people, and publicly like recognizing the individuals. So I think there's a whole lot of tactics that you can deploy that will effectively allow you to build trust in a client setting and so forth. And so I would say that yeah, I would say that that's typically been how I've gone about it.
Thank you so much. So, just a
Mhm.
follow up question: do you ever feel that the stake of what's at hand affects the way you sort of interact with clients? Because again, you have the stake at hand, you have your introversion coming into play. So, has the stake at hand in any way sort of put you in, not put you in ease, sort of, or made your anxieties flare up in that particular moment?
Yeah. So I would say in general, I the way I tend to think about everything is I um I don't necessarily allow the stakes to modify how I'm approaching, a situation, with the exception of like how much prep time I'm putting in, right? Like, let's say I'm going to meet with the CEO of the client. I'll of course put in more prep time than if I'm meeting with somebody who's on the working team level who I interact with every single day, because I know that I'm going to have a very short window of time with that CEO, that maybe I'll have much more time with the person on the working team level. But generally speaking, I think the only way, if I'm nervous about a meeting for any reason, because it's high stakes or whatever it might be, my thing that I do is I just put in as much practice as possible. So if I'm nervous about something, I'll counterbalance that with a tremendous amount of preparation. And I'll prepare as much as I possibly can. And that tends to put my nerves at ease. But generally speaking, once we're actually in the conversation, it doesn't matter whether I'm talking to the CEO of the organization or I'm talking to somebody who's more junior to me. I'm I am going to approach it with the same level of, if I am doing something in that moment, I'm going to do it as well as I can. The only thing that is different is that I will have more prep time for that thing that is a bit higher stakes, but in that actual moment, I'm going to try and deliver regardless of what the level of stakes are for the conversation. What I would say is, for those high stakes meetings, though, if you're nervous about how the outcome might go, again, anything that you can do to make yourself comfortable. If you need to kind of print out if you need to print out a list of the questions that you have to ask, print out a list of the questions that you have to ask. Like, nobody's going to judge you, right? In fact, the CEO will probably appreciate that you thought ahead of time, okay, let me prepare as much as possible for the meeting with this individual. So if you have to kind of print it out, and then if you feel yourself getting, tripped up, and if you feel like you're not hitting the points that you had prepared ahead of time and you really want to hit them, better for you to actually say there and, pause and say, actually, ahead of this meeting, I had kind of, mapped out some of the key areas that I really wanted to cover. And then just take a quick look at the piece of paper, if that gives you confidence. Do whatever you need to do. There's no shame in preparing. So I would say that that tends to be how I think about high stake conversations.
Thank you so much. That's about
Mhm.
it from me.
Hi Tristan, Ajay here. I had a question for you. Basically, I'm a software developer from India. So, from a professional point of view, whenever we initiate any conversation, so initially we try to, sometimes we mess up with the conversation, right? Whether it can be a personal conversation or professional conversation. So, how can we come back in that and win that conversation? Are there any talking points or checklist to keep in mind?
Yeah. So I would try to overall, I guess the first thing I would say is I would try not to put so much pressure on yourself in the situation, meaning even something as like, I messed up in this conversation. Conversations in my mind are very fluid. There's no such thing as is messing up. If you misspoke, you misspoke. If you provided, incorrect or outdated data, you provided incorrect and outdated data. I think the best way to address those situations is always to just be open, honest, and communicative about them. So if you're doing a presentation and you realize that, oh, your presentation is actually based on data that is no longer like up the most up to date, mention to them, I'm realizing now as we're covering this that, I will actually be able to pull an updated set of numbers. So I'll do that and then I'll recirculate it. But overall, this is the message and this is the direction that we're headed. So I would say own it if it's a mistake that you've made. And generally speaking, as long as you're going about these things with good intentions, I don't think you have to worry too much about, oh, I said something and now I've put my foot in my mouth and I've messed up. In general, I think that the more you think about messing up, the more likely you are to actually make a mistake. So I would just go in there, go into these conversations with your game plan, envisioning yourself succeeding and having a good conversation. If something pops up that you realize retrospectively was a mistake, just own that mistake and then move on. Don't allow that mistake to remain top of mind and then get in the way of you being able to be confident and impactful in conversations moving forward. Is how I would go about thinking about it.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Tristan. And it was a wonderful session overall. And thanks, Vishal, for sharing this across in LinkedIn.
Looks like that was it, Tristan. Any closing remarks from your end?
When it comes to this idea of introversion and extroversion, I really don't believe that there is any right or wrong, good or bad. Like everything else, I think teams thrive when you have a good combination of people who bring different things to the table. So what I would say is really try to observe and think about what the dynamics are of your team. If you feel like your team is heavily packed with extroverts, then think about, okay, what are some of the tendencies that I as an introvert have that I can basically bring that's going to better balance this team out and make it more impactful. If your team skews towards introverts, then think to yourself, okay, I'm an introvert. Who are the extroverts in this environment? And is there a way that I can help enable that individual, right? Because we talked about how an extrovert can help an introvert, but introverts can help extroverts as well. Everybody should be trying to help each other. And so just try to kind of think about what your natural comfort zone is, map that to the context in terms of your current surrounding, think about where you can contribute the most. And yeah, that would be my thought there. But I feel as though when people use the word introverted, there's oftentimes this negative connotation with it, which I don't personally subscribe to or believe. I think that I'm an introvert and very happily an introvert. And for me, I just think being aware of it is helpful because I know where I derive my energy and it allows me to be much more effective. So if you can really get that pulse in terms of what things in life give you energy and what things take you away, take that energy away from you, I think you're really setting yourself up to be as successful as you can be. So with that, thank you everybody for dialing in. Vishal and Gary, thank you so much for organizing, and Gary for putting together the slides, and really enjoyed the conversation today. If anybody has any questions, please do feel free to shoot me a message on LinkedIn. Thank you.